Still awake? Great. I have a story for you. Imagine a city rising out of the jungle, stone towers catching the last amber light of a tropical afternoon. The air so thick and warm it sits on your skin like a second layer of clothing. You can smell the copal incense drifting from temple platforms so tall they disappear into the clouds, and below, 100,000 people are going about their evening, grinding maize, haggling at market stalls, drawing water from reservoirs that somehow never run dry. It is one of the most sophisticated civilizations the ancient world has ever produced. And then, over the course of a century or two, the cities are abandoned. The jungle swallows the plazas. The reservoirs crack and go still. The people disappear. Where did they go? And why? Tonight we are going to explore one of the greatest unsolved mysteries in all of human history, the collapse of the classic Maya civilization. We will investigate what the stones and the bones and the buried pollen grains have been quietly telling scientists for decades. We will follow the rise of a culture so brilliant it mapped the stars with naked eyes and built calendars more precise than anything Europe would manage for another 1,000 years. And we will reveal why the answer to their disappearance is far more complicated, far more human, and far more relevant to our own moment than most people ever expect. If you are someone who loves falling asleep to stories like this one, slow, deep, full of history and wonder, this channel was made for you. Subscribe if you haven't already, and leave a comment telling me where you are listening from tonight. Are you in bed with the lamp off? On the couch with a blanket? Somewhere far away where it is already almost morning? I love knowing where these stories travel. But for now, let your shoulders drop. Let the tension in your jaw go loose. There's nowhere you need to be. Nothing you need to decide. Just this voice, and the jungle, and a civilization full of questions. Now close your eyes, and let the story take you away. There is a particular quality to the silence inside an abandoned Maya city. If you have ever stood inside one of them, Tikal, perhaps, or Palenque, or the ghost-quiet plazas of Copan, you will know what I mean. The birds are loud. The insects are relentless. The wind moves through the ceiba trees with a sound like distant breathing. But underneath all of that, underneath the noise of the living jungle, there is a deeper silence. The silence of things that used to be full and are now empty. Of rooms where people slept. Of staircases where children ran. Of courtyards where priests once stood in jade and quetzal feathers, watching the sky with an intensity that bordered on obsession. That silence has been asking a question for over 1,000 years. To understand a mystery, we first have to understand what was actually lost. And this is where most popular accounts of the Maya collapse get things badly wrong, because what fell was not a single empire, not a unified kingdom with one capital and one king. The classic Maya world was more like a galaxy of city-states, each one brilliant and jealous and intensely proud of itself, spread across a region that today encompasses southern Mexico, Guatemala, Belize, Honduras, and El Salvador. At its height, somewhere around the 6th and 7th centuries of the Common Era, this constellation of cities held a population that historians estimate at somewhere between 5 million and 15 million people. Some scholars push that number higher still. These were not scattered villages. These were metropolises. Tikal, in what is now northern Guatemala, was home to perhaps 90,000 people within its urban core alone. Its great pyramid temples, Temple 1, Temple 4, rose more than 60 meters above the jungle floor. Merchants carried cacao beans and obsidian blades across trade routes that stretched for hundreds of kilometers in every direction. Scribes pressed hieroglyphic texts into bar paper and carved them into stone with a precision that still astonishes epigraphers today. Astronomers tracked the movements of Venus with an accuracy that differed from modern calculations by only a matter of seconds per year. Let that sink in for a moment. A civilization without telescopes, without computers, without any of the instruments we take for granted, and they were tracking the orbit of Venus to within seconds of accuracy, working purely from patient, generational observation, writing it all down, passing it forward. This was not a primitive people stumbling through the forest. This was a civilization at full power. And the writing. This is something that deserves its own quiet moment of appreciation, because the Maya developed one of only a handful of fully independent writing systems in all of human history. Fully independent means it was invented from scratch, without borrowing from any other tradition. Mesopotamia had cuneiform. Egypt had hieroglyphics. China developed its own script. And in Mesoamerica, the Maya built a system of glyphs so complex, so layered with phonetic and logographic information, that it took modern scholars the better part of the 20th century to crack it. The man who first broke the code, or rather, who first proposed the right theory for how to break it, was a Soviet linguist named Yuri Knorozov, working in Leningrad in the early 1950s, analyzing photographs of Maya manuscripts he had never personally seen, in a civilization he had never visited, in a hemisphere where he had never set foot. He published his findings. The academic establishment largely ignored him for 2 decades. He was right anyway. By the time the decipherment truly gained momentum in the 1970s and 1980s, what emerged from the stone texts was not what anyone had expected. For a long time, the popular image of the Maya, the image projected by early 20th century scholars, was of a peaceful, priestly people, obsessed with time and the stars, somehow above the bloodshed that characterized other ancient civilizations. Philosopher-astronomers in the jungle, serene and otherworldly. The inscriptions told a very different story. What the glyphs described in patient and sometimes gleeful detail was a world of constant warfare, of kings captured and humiliated in elaborate ritual performances, of political marriages arranged and betrayed, of cities rising to dominance and then being crushed by ambitious neighbors, their monuments defaced, their rulers depicted kneeling in subjugation on the victory stele of their conquerors. The classic Maya world was not a utopia. It was intensely human, competitive, violent, glorious, and fragile in ways that its inhabitants may not have fully understood until it was far too late. And here is where the story gets complicated. Here is where it stops being the story of a mysterious disappearance and starts being something far more unsettling. A story about the slow unraveling of systems that everyone assumed were permanent, because the collapse did not happen overnight. This is perhaps the single most important thing to understand, and also the thing that tends to get lost when people talk about the Maya collapse as if it were a single catastrophic event, a meteor, a plague, a sudden and dramatic ending. The collapse was a process. It unfolded over roughly 2 centuries, from approximately the late 7th century to the end of the 9th century of the Common Era, concentrated primarily in the southern lowlands, that dense heartland of jungle and limestone that had been the center of Maya power for generations. It moved like a slow tide going out. First, the monumental construction slows. The great building projects that had consumed enormous quantities of human labor and political will, the pyramids, the plazas, the elaborate palace complexes, begin to taper off. The inscriptions on stele, which had been erected with meticulous regularity to commemorate the accomplishments of kings, become less frequent. Some cities erect their last dated monument in the 800s. A few manage to hold on into the 900s. And then nothing. The stone falls silent. The jungle moves in. If you were living through it, would you have known? That is the question that haunts me most about this period. Would you have felt, in your daily life, the slow accumulation of pressures that was pulling your world apart? Or would each individual year have felt more or less like the one before it? Difficult, yes. Perhaps hungry. Perhaps tense with the news of distant wars. But not apocalyptic? Not the end of everything. This is the part of the Maya story that no dramatic film or documentary really captures, because drama demands a single cause. A single moment. A villain you can name. The truth of the classic Maya collapse is that it was almost certainly the result of multiple factors converging over generations. A kind of terrible perfect storm assembled from drought and warfare and deforestation and political instability and population pressure and soil exhaustion and the slow, grinding failure of the systems that held everything together. And the evidence for this has been accumulating, piece by piece, from sources you would never expect, from the mud at the bottom of ancient lakes, for instance. This is one of the quietest and most remarkable stories in all of archaeological science. The way that lake sediment cores have become one of our most powerful tools for reconstructing ancient climate. Every year, as seasons pass, microscopic particles settle to the bottom of a lake. Pollen from nearby plants, charcoal from fires, tiny organisms whose populations rise and fall with changes in water temperature and salinity. Layer by layer, year by year, these particles accumulate in the sediment like the pages of a very slow book. Scientists drilling cores from lakes across the Maya lowlands have been reading that book for decades now. And what it tells them about the climate of the classic Maya period is striking. Beginning around the 7th and 8th centuries of the Common Era, precisely the period when the first signs of political instability appear in the inscriptions, the pollen record begins to show something alarming. The rain was failing. Not all at once. Not catastrophically. Not in every location at the same moment. But in recurring episodes of reduced rainfall, what climatologists call mega-droughts. The evidence is now, after decades of research, becoming difficult to dispute. The lakes were shrinking. The pollen from water-dependent plants was declining. The charcoal layers were thickening, suggesting more frequent fires in a landscape that was becoming dangerously dry. And the Maya had built an entire civilization on water. This is something that tends to surprise people, because the image of the jungle, dense, green, dripping, suggests an environment of almost overwhelming abundance. But the Maya lowlands sit on a bed of porous limestone that drains almost immediately. There are very few rivers of any size. The rainfall, when it comes hard and fast and disappears into the ground. What the Maya had engineered, with extraordinary ingenuity, was a system of reservoirs, canals, raised fields, and catchment basins that allowed them to store the wet season's bounty and survive the dry season without catastrophic losses. That system worked beautifully, right up until the moment the wet season became unreliable. And when the rains began to fail, the reservoirs began to empty. And when the reservoirs emptied, the crops failed. And when the crops failed, in a civilization of millions of people accustomed to a certain level of agricultural surplus, the political consequences were not long in arriving. Think about what hunger does to politics. Not the ordinary hunger of a missed meal, not the discomfort of a lean week, but the deep, structural hunger of a population that has grown too large for the land to reliably feed when the land begins to fail. That kind of hunger does not make people patient. It does not make them philosophical. It makes them desperate, and desperation has a very particular effect on the relationship between a people and its rulers. The Maya king, the Ajaw, in the Yucatec Maya language, was not simply a political leader in any sense that we in the modern world would immediately recognize. He was a sacred intermediary, a living axis between the human world and the divine one. His primary function, in the cosmological understanding of classic Maya society, was not to govern in a bureaucratic sense, but to maintain the proper relationship between his city and the forces that governed rain and harvest and the turning of the seasons. He performed bloodletting rituals. He conducted elaborate ceremonies at precise astronomical moments. He communicated, through his royal body, with the gods and ancestors who controlled the fate of the crops, which means that when the crops failed, it was not simply a natural disaster. It was a theological catastrophe. It meant the king was failing at the one thing he was supposed to be for. It raised questions, quiet at first, then louder, about whether this particular dynasty, This particular bloodline still held the favor of the heavens, and in a world where political legitimacy was inseparable from sacred legitimacy, those questions were not abstract. They were existential. They were the kind of questions that ended dynasties, and the kings knew this. You can see it if you know how to read the inscriptions, in the way that the rhetoric of the late classic period becomes increasingly strained. The stelae from the 8th century tend toward a certain defensive grandiosity, as if the kings were arguing with doubts rather than simply proclaiming victories. The monuments are larger in some cases than they had been in earlier periods, as if scale itself could substitute for the confidence that was quietly draining away. There is something deeply human in that impulse. When authority begins to slip, the instinct is often to perform it more loudly. But performance has a cost, and that cost was paid by the people at the base of the social pyramid. Because the great building projects of the classic Maya, those soaring temples, those immaculate plazas resurfaced with white lime plaster so bright they could be seen for kilometers. All of that required labor, enormous quantities of it, organized, extracted, compelled, and it required food to fuel that labor. And food was exactly what was becoming scarce. The Maya burned limestone to make their plaster. Burning limestone requires wood, enormous quantities of wood. Researchers studying the charcoal and pollen records from the lowlands have found compelling evidence that by the height of the classic period, the forests surrounding many major cities had been dramatically reduced, in some areas, stripped almost entirely, to feed the insatiable appetite of construction and fuel and cooking fires for hundreds of thousands of people. What this means, in practical terms, is that the landscape itself was changing in ways that made drought worse. Trees hold moisture. Tree roots stabilize soil. Tree canopies slow evaporation. When you remove the forest from a limestone plateau and replace it with fields and plaster and the bare earth of an expanding city, you create a landscape that is fundamentally more vulnerable to the failure of rain. You make a bad situation more likely. And then, when the drought comes anyway, you have less capacity to absorb it. This is not a unique story. This is a pattern that shows up with depressing regularity across the collapse narratives of a dozen ancient civilizations. The Easter Islanders stripped their forests. The Bronze Age collapse in the Eastern Mediterranean was preceded by decades of landscape degradation. The Anasazi of the American Southwest built their great houses in a landscape they were simultaneously exhausting. Civilizations have a tendency to consume the very foundations of their own success, not out of stupidity, not out of malice, but because the feedback loops are slow and the pressures of the present are always more immediate than the warnings of the future. The Maya were brilliant. They were not prescient. And onto this landscape of thinning forests and unreliable rains, the political crises of the late classic period descended like a second storm. War between Maya cities was not new. It had been a constant of classic Maya life since at least the early centuries of the Common Era, woven into the ritual calendar, institutionalized in the taking of high-status captives for sacrifice, encoded in the elaborate vocabulary of the inscriptions, with their ball-cord imagery and their Star Wars glyphs. But the warfare of the late classic period seems to have changed in character, become less ritualized, more destructive, less about the capture of noble prisoners and the performance of dominance, and more about the desperate competition for resources that were no longer abundant enough to go around. Some researchers describe it as a shift from prestige warfare to subsistence warfare. The distinction matters. Prestige warfare is, in a dark way, almost manageable. It has rules. It has limits. It is fundamentally about status and theater. Subsistence warfare is about survival. It is about who controls the water, who controls the remaining fertile fields, who gets to eat and who does not. That kind of warfare does not end cleanly. It tends to escalate until something breaks, and things began to break. Quirigua, in what is now eastern Guatemala, had spent generations in the shadow of the great city of Köpen, its neighbor and overlord to the south. In the year 738 of the Common Era, 738 CE, the ruler of Quirigua, a king whose name glyph translates roughly as Cog Sky, captured the ruler of Köpen. His name was 18 Rabbit, one of the most celebrated kings in all of classic Maya history, a man who had ruled for more than 4 decades and presided over what many consider the artistic golden age of Köpen. Cog Sky had him sacrificed. The political shockwave from that single act reverberated across the Maya world for generations. Köpen never fully recovered its former dominance. Its last major monument was erected roughly 60 years later, in the year 820 of the Common Era, 820 C, and then the site falls archaeologically silent, while the jungle crowds back and around the extraordinary sculpture galleries that 18 Rabbit had spent a lifetime building. This is one of the things that makes the collapse so haunting to follow in the historical record. The way individual stories of ambition and downfall repeat themselves across different cities and different generations, like variations on the same theme. Every city's ending has its own specific texture. Köpen went out slowly, its artistic tradition outlasting its political power by decades. Dos Pilas, further north, collapsed in a sudden and violent implosion, its defensive walls built from the stones of its own dismantled monuments, a city literally tearing itself apart in a last desperate attempt at self-preservation. Palenque, the jewel of the western lowlands, produced its last dated inscription in the year 822 CE, 822 CE, and simply went quiet. Can you imagine what that silence felt like to the people who remained? Because it is important to hold on to something that the archaeology makes easy to forget, that the collapse, as gradual and complex as it was not an abstraction for the people living through it. It was a lived experience. It was mothers watching their children go thin. It was farmers digging at cracked soil that refused to yield. It was the sound of a city that used to hum with tens of thousands of voices growing quieter, year by year, as families made the terrible calculus of staying or leaving, and more of them chose to leave. Where did they go? This is a question archaeologists have been working to answer for decades, and the evidence increasingly suggests that the collapse of the southern lowlands was not simply a death. It was a migration, a massive, multi-generational redistribution of population northward, toward the Yucatan Peninsula, where rainfall patterns were somewhat different, where new cities, Chichen Itza, Uxmal, Koba, were rising to fill the political vacuum that the collapse of the South had created. The Maya did not disappear. This cannot be said clearly enough, and yet it remains one of the most persistent myths surrounding the classic collapse, the idea that an entire civilization simply vanished, leaving only ruins and silence. The truth is messier, more human, and in a strange way more hopeful. The people walked. They carried their knowledge with them. They rebuilt. But the cities of the southern lowlands, those extraordinary monuments to human ambition and mathematical genius and theological fervor, those were, indeed, abandoned. And the jungle, which had never stopped pressing at the edges, moved back in with a patience that no human institution could match. Roots split the plazas. Vines pulled down the carved facades. The white plaster that had once gleamed under the tropical sun turned gray, then green, then disappeared entirely beneath a skin of moss and climbing figs. And in that slow reclamation, something important happened to the memory of what had been there. By the time the Spanish arrived in the 16th century, carrying their own catastrophes, their own diseases and ambitions and theological certainties, even the descendants of the classic Maya had largely lost the ability to read the inscriptions on the monuments that their ancestors had carved. The writing system that Yuri Knorozov would not crack for another 400 years was already, by then, a mystery. The great calendrical knowledge was preserved in fragments. The deep history, the names of the kings, the dates of their victories and defeats, The stories that the stones so patiently encoded was gone from living memory. It is one of the most profound intellectual losses in human history. Not a burning library, not a single catastrophic act of destruction, but something slower and in some ways sadder, a gradual forgetting, the long fade of a tradition that no longer had the institutional structure to sustain itself. And yet the stones remembered. They were waiting for centuries, through the Spanish colonial period, through the chaos of the independence era, through 2 world wars, and the entire upheaval of the modern age, waiting for someone patient enough to learn their language again. The first Europeans to encounter the ruins of the great Maya cities were not archaeologists. They were not scientists. They were conquistadors, missionaries, colonial administrators, men whose primary interest in the ancient world extended only as far as it could be made useful to the present one. And their reactions to what they found ranged from genuine astonishment to active hostility, depending on who they were and what they believed the ruins represented. Diego de Landa was both the greatest preserver and the greatest destroyer of Maya knowledge that history has to offer. And the contradiction at the heart of his story says something important about the way civilizations treat the things they do not understand. He arrived in the Yucatan in the 1540s, a Franciscan friar of absolute conviction and considerable intelligence, and he spent years learning the Yucatec Maya language with a dedication that very few of his contemporaries could match. He was genuinely curious about the people he had come to convert. He recorded their customs, their ceremonies, their calendar systems, their way of counting time. He interviewed elders. He took notes. He compiled, over years of patient inquiry, a document that would eventually become known as the Relation de las Cosas de Yucatan, an account of Maya life and culture that remains, despite everything, one of the most valuable sources we have for understanding the post-classic Maya world. And then, in the year 1562, he presided over one of the most devastating acts of cultural destruction in the history of the Americas. At the town of Mani, in what is now the Mexican state of Yucatan, Diego de Landa gathered an unknown quantity of Maya manuscripts, bark paper books, folded accordion style, covered in the hieroglyphic writing that contained centuries of astronomical knowledge, historical records, ritual calendars, medical texts, mythological narratives, and he burned them, all of them, in a single afternoon. He later wrote that they contained nothing but superstition and falsehood. He wrote this in the same document where he described, with apparent admiration, the sophistication of Maya astronomical observation. Only 4 Maya books, what scholars call codices, are known to have survived. 4, out of a library that must have contained thousands. The Dresden Codex, the Madrid Codex, the Paris Codex, and a fragment identified only in the 1970s, the so-called Grolier Codex. For thin survivors of a catastrophe that was not geological, not climatic, not the result of any of the complex systemic pressures that had brought down the classic cities 8 centuries earlier, but the result of one man's certainty on one afternoon, with a fire that took perhaps a few hours to consume what had taken generations to create. When you think about the classic Maya collapse and what was lost, all that knowledge, all that accumulated observation of the sky and the soil and the turning of the seasons, it is worth remembering that the loss did not end with the abandonment of the southern cities. It continued in waves for centuries afterward. The jungle took the stones. The fires took the books. The diseases that arrived with the Spanish, smallpox, measles, typhus, moving through populations with no immunity like a slow catastrophe, took the people. By some estimates, the indigenous population of Mesoamerica declined by somewhere between 50 and 90% in the century following European contact. 90%. Numbers like that resist comprehension. They are too large for grief in any ordinary sense. They require a different kind of reckoning, a long, slow acknowledgement of what the world lost, and what it might have known, and what questions might have been answered by now if things had gone differently. But this is where the story of the Maya collapse takes an unexpected turn, because the 20th and 21st centuries have seen a gradual, remarkable, and still ongoing recovery of what was lost. Not a full recovery. Nothing so clean or complete as that, but a recovery nonetheless, driven by the stubborn curiosity of scholars from a dozen different disciplines, and increasingly by the Maya people themselves. The decipherment of the hieroglyphic script, which accelerated dramatically through the 1970s and 80s, was not simply an academic achievement. It was an act of restoration. Every glyph decoded was a voice returned to audibility. Every inscription that yielded its meaning gave back to the historical record a name, a date, a political event, a fragment of human experience that had been silent for over 1,000 years. Scholars like Linda Skeel, David Stewart, and many others spent their careers crouched over photographs and plaster casts of inscriptions, working out the phonetic logic of a script that nobody had read fluently since the 9th century. Their work transformed our understanding of classic Maya history so completely that textbooks written before the decipherment are, in many respects, works about a different civilization, the imagined, peaceful, astronomer-priest Maya that the 20th century had invented to replace the complex, war-torn, brilliantly human reality. And alongside the epigraphers, the climate scientists were drilling their lake cores. The soil scientists were analyzing ancient agricultural terraces. The physical anthropologists were studying skeletal remains for signs of nutritional stress and disease. The paleoethnobotanists, specialists in ancient plant remains, were sifting through the charcoal and pollen preserved in middens and floors and the sediment of long-dried reservoirs, reconstructing the ecology of the Maya lowlands across centuries of change. What began to emerge from all of this, by the early years of the 21st century, was not a single clean answer to the question of the collapse. It was something more honest than that. It was a picture of almost unbearable complexity, a civilization under simultaneous pressure from multiple directions, each crisis amplifying the others, each solution generating new problems, the whole system oscillating with increasing instability until, in city after city across the southern lowlands, the capacity to maintain order simply ran out. There is a concept in systems theory called cascading failure. It describes what happens when a complex system, one made of many interlocking parts, each dependent on the others, begins to come apart. The failure of one component places greater stress on adjacent components. Those components, now stressed beyond their design tolerance, begin to fail in turn. And because everything is connected, because the system was designed around the assumption that all the parts would function, the failure spreads faster than any single intervention can stop it. The whole thing comes down not in one dramatic moment, but in a sequence of collapses, each one making the next more likely. The classic Maya world was a system of extraordinary complexity. Its cities were linked by trade routes and political alliances and marriage networks and shared religious traditions. Its agricultural system depended on the maintenance of infrastructure, reservoirs, canals, terraced fields, that required sustained collective effort to keep functioning. Its political authority rested on a theology that tied the legitimacy of kings to their ability to deliver prosperity and reign. Every one of these linkages was a strength in good times and a vulnerability in bad ones. When the rains began to fail with increasing frequency in the 7th and 8th centuries, when the reservoirs dropped and the crops struggled, and the population that had grown so large during the prosperous centuries of the classic peak began to press against the limits of what a degraded landscape could provide, the pressure on the political system became acute. Kings who could not deliver rain lost sacred authority. Kings who lost sacred authority faced challenges from rivals within their own cities, and from ambitious neighbors who sensed weakness. Warfare increased. Trade networks were disrupted. The agricultural infrastructure, which required organized labor to maintain, began to decay, as that labor was redirected toward defense and diverted by displacement. And the more the infrastructure decayed, the more vulnerable the cities became to the next drought, and the next, and the one after that. You can trace this pattern, city by city, in the archaeological record. And what strikes you, following it across the landscape, is how lonely each collapse must have felt to the people living through it. Because the cities did not all fall at once. They fell in sequence, over generations, which means that for much of the collapse period there were still functioning cities, still courts where kings held power, still markets and ceremonies, and the ordinary texture of urban life. Even as, somewhere in the jungle not so very far away, another city was going quiet. What did the people of Tikal make of the news from Köpen? What stories traveled along the trade routes about cities that were emptying, about populations moving north, about monuments that no one was maintaining? Did they think it could not happen to them? Did they believe their own kings were different, their own gods more reliable, their own reservoirs deeper? Or did some of them know, in the quiet, private way that people sometimes know things they cannot say out loud, that what was happening to their neighbors was not so very different from what was happening to them? The last dated monument at Tikal was erected in the year 909 of the Common Era, 909 C. It is a modest thing, by the standards of what Tikal had produced in its golden centuries. The text is incomplete. The carving is less refined than what the city's artisans had managed 200 years before. It has the feel of something done under pressure, without the full resources that such an act once commanded. After that, nothing. The great city that had once held 90,000 people did not end with a battle or a fire or a single datable catastrophe. It simply stopped. The last residents, whoever they were, however many remained by then, eventually left or died, and the jungle did what it always does when human hands stop pushing it back. It is not a dramatic ending, but there is something in that quiet, that slow and almost gentle erasure, that carries more weight than any dramatic ending could, because it tells you that the people did not leave all at once in a panic. They left gradually, family by family, season by season, making practical decisions in response to practical pressures. They were not fleeing a disaster. They were adapting to one, the only way ordinary people can, one step at a time, in the direction of somewhere that still promised to sustain them. And somewhere in the northern Yucatan, a new city was beginning to find its feet. Chichen Itza is a name that most people in the modern world have heard, even if they cannot quite place it on a map. It appears on travel posters and in documentary thumbnails and on those lists of the world's great ancient wonders that circulate endlessly on the internet. The image is almost always the same. The Great Step Pyramid that archaeologists call El Castillo, rising clean and geometric against a blue sky. Its 4 staircases converging at the top, like a diagram of cosmic order made in stone. What those images almost never capture is what Chichen Itza actually represented in its own time. The strangeness of it, the deliberate and almost aggressive novelty of a city that looked like nothing the Maya lowlands had produced before. Because Chichen Itza was different. From the moment its major building phase began, somewhere in the 9th and 10th centuries of the Common Era, the city announced itself as something new. Its architecture borrowed forms from distant traditions, from the Gulf Coast, from central Mexico, from a cultural sphere centered on the great city of Tula in what is now the Mexican state of Hidalgo. The feathered serpent, the deity the Nahuatl-speaking peoples of central Mexico called Quetzalcoatl, appears all over Chichen Itza, carved on columns, cascading down the balustrades of staircases, integrated into the iconography of a city that was, in some fundamental sense, reaching outward across Mesoamerica and pulling in influences from everywhere it could reach. Historians and archaeologists have argued for decades about what this means. Some have seen it as evidence of actual migration, of Toltec warriors or merchants arriving in Yucatan and imposing their cultural forms on a Maya population. Others see it as deliberate stylistic borrowing by Maya elites who were consciously constructing a new kind of political identity, one that transcended the regional traditions of the classic period and laid claim to something larger and more cosmopolitan. The debate is not fully resolved. It probably never will be, not with the evidence currently available. But what is clear is that Chichen Itza worked, at least for a while. In the 10th and 11th centuries, the city functioned as something close to a regional capital for the northern Yucatan, a place where the trade routes converged, where the ritual calendar was observed with elaborate ceremony, where the Great Ball Court, the largest in all of Mesoamerica, 368 feet long and 230 feet wide, hosted contests whose stakes were not merely athletic. The ball game. It deserves a moment of its own. Across Mesoamerica, from the Gulf Coast lowlands to the highlands of Oaxaca, from the Pacific shores of Guatemala to the karst plains of Yucatan, the rubber ball game was played for at least 3,000 years. The rules varied by region and period. The ball, solid rubber, impossibly heavy by the standards of any modern sport, was kept in motion using the hips, the knees, the elbows. The object was to pass it through a stone ring mounted high on the court wall, and the ring at Chichen Itza is set so high and angled so precisely that anyone who has stood in that court and looked up at it understands immediately that a successful shot was not a common occurrence. When it happened, it must have felt like a miracle. The iconography of the Great Ball Court at Chichen Itza depicts decapitation, a player kneeling while another stands over him, a great arc of blood transformed in the sculpture into flowering serpents rising from a severed neck. Whether this represents the actual sacrifice of losing players, or the ritual performance of a mythological narrative, or something more complex that we do not yet fully understand, remains a subject of genuine scholarly debate. What it tells us unambiguously is that the stakes, in the imagination of the people who carved those panels, were absolute. This was not recreation. This was cosmology enacted in the body. And Chichen Itza's most famous astronomical feature, the shadow of the feathered serpent that descends the northern staircase of El Castillo at the spring and autumn equinoxes, the afternoon light, creating a series of triangular shadows that appear to ripple down the balustrade like a great snake in motion. This too tells you something about the world its builders were trying to sustain. A world where the movements of the sky and the affairs of human beings were not separate things, where architecture was a kind of prayer and engineering was a kind of theology. The city held its prominence for perhaps 2 centuries, and then, in patterns that will by now feel familiar, the political order began to fracture. The fall of Chichen Itza is wrapped in legend and oral tradition as much as in archaeology, and the legends tell of a lord named Hunaxil, a ruler of the rival city of Mayapan, who overthrew the power of Chichen Itza sometime in the 12th or 13th century through a combination of political cunning and military force. The details are murky, filtered through documents written down centuries after the events they describe. But the broad outline, the rise of Mayapan as the dominant power in the northern Yucatan after the eclipse of Chichen Itza, is supported by the archaeological record. Mayapan is a fascinating and deeply underappreciated city. It was, at its height in the 13th and 14th centuries, home to perhaps 15,000 people, much smaller than the great classic cities of the south, but densely packed within a defensive wall that enclosed the entire urban core. This is significant. The classic Maya cities, even in the turbulent late period, had not typically built walls around themselves in this way. Mayapan's wall speaks of a different world, a world in which security could no longer be assumed, in which the threat of sudden violence was considered permanent enough to require permanent architecture in response. Inside that wall, the city's rulers, a lineage known as the Kakam, maintained their authority partly through a remarkable political innovation. They required the heads of subordinate noble families from across the Yucatan to reside in Mayapan, essentially as permanent guests, or perhaps more honestly as permanent hostages. Their families, their households, their retinues all relocated to the capital. It was a system designed to prevent rebellion by making the potential rebels visible, controllable, present. It worked, for a time, the way all systems based on constraint work, until the pressure became too great, and the constrained became desperate enough to push back. In the year 1441 of the Common Era, 1441 CE, a coalition of noble families rose against the Kakam, killed most of them, and burned Mayapan to the ground. The city was abandoned, and with it fell the last attempt at centralized political authority over the Yucatan Peninsula before the Spanish arrived. What followed was a period that historians call the late post-classic, a fragmented landscape of small, competitive city-states, each one ruled by its own lord, each one eyeing its neighbors with the weary suspicion of people who have seen too many coalitions fall apart. It was into this fractured world that the Spanish stepped in the 1500s, and the fragmentation that had made the Maya vulnerable was also, in certain painful ways, part of what made the conquest so drawn out and so complicated. The Spanish could not simply defeat one capital and claim the whole. They had to fight for every corner of the Yucatan, city by city, decade by decade. The full subjugation of the Maya took longer than the conquest of the Aztec Empire, longer in some respects than almost anything else the Spanish attempted in the Americas. The last independent Maya kingdom, Tayasal, in the remote lake district of what is now northern Guatemala, an island city in the middle of Lake Petén, did not fall until the year 1697 of the Common Era. 1697. Nearly 200 years after Hernán Cortés had landed on the Mexican coast. Nearly 200 years of resistance, maintained in the jungle and on the water, by a people who had absorbed more catastrophe than most civilizations in history and had kept finding ways to go on. That stubborn persistence is, in some ways, the thing that the popular narrative of the Maya collapse most consistently fails to honor. The story gets told as a tragedy of endings, fallen cities, silent stones, lost books, vanished knowledge. And it is a tragedy, genuinely and without minimization. What was lost was real, and the loss matters. But the people did not end. The culture did not end. The languages, and there are more than 30 distinct Maya languages spoken today, by somewhere between 6 and 8 million people across Mexico and Central America. The languages did not end. There are Maya scholars today who are working with the deciphered inscriptions, not simply as external researchers studying an ancient civilization, but as descendants engaging with the records of their own ancestors. When a contemporary Kitsch, Maya linguist reads a classic period glyph and recognizes a word, a grammatical structure, a root that is still alive in the language spoken by her grandmother, that is not merely an academic discovery. It is something closer to a reunion, a thread of continuity across 1,200 years of catastrophe. And the questions that the classic collapse raises about sustainability, about the relationship between climate and political stability, about what happens when a civilization's infrastructure fails faster than its institutions can adapt. Those questions are not merely historical curiosities. They are the questions of our own moment, dressed in different clothes. We live in a world of warming temperatures and shifting rainfall patterns. We live in a world where agricultural systems that developed under one set of climatic assumptions are beginning to encounter a different set of realities. We live in a world where complex, interlocking systems, supply chains, energy grids, political institutions are being tested by pressures that their architects did not fully anticipate. The classic Maya did not see their collapse coming, not in its full dimensions, not until the feedback loops had tightened past the point of easy reversal. That is not a condemnation of them. They were working with the knowledge they had, under pressures they understood only partially. making decisions that made sense in the short term even when they were quietly catastrophic in the long one. As perhaps are we. This is not meant as a counsel of despair. The Maya story is not a simple cautionary tale with a clear moral lesson pinned to the end of it, because history is never that cooperative. But there is something in the patience required to understand what happened to the classic Maya. The decades of drilling lake cores, of deciphering glyphs, of sifting pollen from ancient mud. That feels instructive in its own right. The willingness to look closely, to resist the comfort of a single explanation, to hold complexity without collapsing it into something simpler than it actually is. The stones rewarded that patience. They are still rewarding it. Consider, for a moment, what it actually takes to read a stone. Not in the metaphorical sense, not the poetic idea of listening to what the past has to say, but literally, physically, the work of standing in front of a carved limestone stela, 4 or 5 feet tall, its surface weathered by 12 centuries of tropical rain and moss and the slow chemical patience of the jungle, and trying to extract from that eroded surface the precise phonetic values of glyphs that no living person has spoken aloud in over 1,000 years. The work of doing that not for one stela, but for hundreds. Not for one site, but for dozens. Not for one decade, but for a career, or several careers, passed between scholars, like a long conversation conducted across generations. This is what epigraphy actually looks like from the inside, and it is worth sitting with that image for a moment, the sheer human stubbornness of it, before we go back into the history, because without that stubbornness, without those particular people choosing those particular careers and spending those particular decades, almost none of what we now know about the classic Maya collapse would be knowable at all. One of those people was a woman named Tatiana Proskouriakoff. She was born in Tomsk, in Siberia, in the year 1909. 1909, the daughter of a Russian chemist and a physician. Her family emigrated to the United States when she was a child, and she ended up studying architecture at Pennsylvania State University during the 1930s, a decade when the idea of a woman pursuing a technical education was still treated by much of the professional world as a mild eccentricity at best. She was quiet, precise, and possessed of a visual intelligence so acute that it eventually changed the field of Maya studies more completely than almost anyone before or since. She began her association with Maya archaeology almost accidentally, joining an expedition to Piedras Negras in Guatemala as an architectural illustrator, someone hired to make accurate drawings of the buildings and monuments. But Proskouriakoff was not merely recording what she saw. She was analyzing it, and what she noticed, sitting with the dates on the stele at Piedras Negras and mapping them against the sculptural programs of different monuments, was a pattern that no one had articulated before. The inscriptions were recording history. This sounds obvious now. It sounds like the kind of thing that should have been apparent from the beginning. But the prevailing view in Maya studies for most of the first half of the 20th century was that the Maya inscriptions were primarily calendrical and astronomical, records of time, records of celestial events, not records of human individuals and human deeds. The kings depicted on the monuments were thought to be ritual figures, perhaps deified ancestors, perhaps mythological personages. The idea that they were actual historical rulers, that the dates recorded their births and accessions and military victories and deaths, was not the consensus view. Proskouriakoff looked at the numbers and saw something different. She noticed that at Piedras Negras, groups of stelae clustered around date ranges that fit within a single human lifetime. She noticed a recurring pattern of 2 dates separated by a consistent interval, one that corresponded plausibly to birth, another to accession to rulership. She published her findings in 1960, in a paper of almost aggressive clarity, laying out the evidence with the precision of someone who had spent years making sure she was right before she said anything at all. The field shifted. Not instantly. Fields rarely do. but steadily and then completely. The Maya inscriptions were historical documents. The figures on the monuments were real people. The events they recorded had actually happened. And once you know that, once you accept that the stones are telling you about real human beings with names and ambitions and enemies and deaths, the entire landscape of classic Maya history changes texture. It becomes personal in a way that purely calendrical or astronomical records never could be. You find yourself reading about a specific king, making a specific decision on a specific day, and the gap across the centuries narrows to something almost intimate. Take the story of Lady Six Sky. She was a princess of the great city of Dos Pilas, in the Patexbatan region of what is now southwestern Guatemala, and in the year 682 of the Common Era, 682 CE, she traveled north alone, or as alone as a Maya royal ever was, surrounded by her retinue, her advisors, her guards, to the small and relatively undistinguished city of Naranjo. Naranjo had been defeated in war. Its dynasty had been humiliated. Its political authority had collapsed to the point where it could no longer project power, could no longer credibly claim the sacred legitimacy that Maya kingship required. It needed restoration, and Dos Pilas sent it a princess. What Lady Six Sky did over the following years, as recorded in the inscriptions at Naranjo, was extraordinary. She conducted rituals. She performed the ceremonies of political legitimacy that would re-establish the city's connection to the divine order. And she produced a son, a king, who, once he came of age, would lead Naranjo on an aggressive military campaign against its neighbors that transformed the city from a defeated backwater into a regional power. The monuments show Lady Six Sky standing on the backs of captives. This is not a metaphor. This is Maya royal iconography at its most direct, the literal and symbolic domination of enemies, performed in stone for perpetuity. She is shown in the full regalia of a ruler, which in the classic Maya world was a statement almost without parallel, because Maya rulership was structured overwhelmingly around male succession. Lady Six Sky did not take the title of queen in the way a European monarch might. She held power through the body of her son, through the legitimacy she embodied and transmitted, and yet the monuments celebrate her with an intensity that makes clear she was, in every practical sense, the one who held Naranjo together during the years it mattered most. Her story is also, quietly, a window into the way that the political crises of the late Classic period were generating new and improvised solutions. A city so weakened that it needed to import its dynastic legitimacy from outside. A woman deployed as a political instrument, and then becoming something considerably more than that. The old certainties of the classic order bending under pressure. The system adapting in ways that its founders almost certainly had not anticipated. This kind of improvisation, this kind of creative response to structural failure, was happening all across the Maya world in the 7th and 8th centuries. And it is important because it reminds us that the people living through the collapse were not passive. They were not simply watching their world fall apart with resigned acceptance. They were trying things. They were attempting to maintain, repair, reconstruct, redirect. The collapse happened not because the Maya gave up, but because the pressures were, ultimately, larger than the solutions available. The drought data makes this painfully clear. In the years 2012 and 2018, two separate research teams published analyses of sediment cores from different sites across the Maya lowlands, one from Lake Xixancanab in the Yucatan, one from a site in Belize, that provided the most precise reconstruction yet of rainfall patterns during the collapse period. What they found was that the terminal Classic period, roughly the 9th century of the Common Era, coincided with a series of droughts more severe than anything the region had experienced in the preceding millennium. The figures that emerged from this research were stark. Annual rainfall may have declined by between 40 and 70% during the most intense drought episodes. For a civilization whose agricultural system had been calibrated over centuries to a particular rainfall regime. A reduction of that magnitude was not a challenge to be managed. It was a civilizational emergency. And here's what makes the drought data so compelling as a piece of the puzzle. It is not, on its own, sufficient, because the northern Yucatan experienced some of the same climatic stress during this period, and yet cities in the north did not collapse in the same way. They declined, some of them. They transformed. But the catastrophic abandonment that characterized the southern lowlands was not replicated with the same intensity in the north, which means the drought was not acting alone. The difference between south and north, and researchers have been working through this for years, seems to lie in a combination of factors. The northern Yucatan had access to natural wells, the extraordinary sinkholes called cenotes, that gave its cities a baseline water security the south could not match. The political structure of the north, already somewhat different in character from the great dynastic kingdoms of Pedon, may have been more flexible, less dependent on the specific ideology of divine kingship that made the southern political system so brittle when its sacred foundations began to crack. And the south, crucially, had been more densely settled, more thoroughly deforested, more agriculturally intensive. It had pushed harder against the limits of its landscape and had less resilience left when those limits began to push back. This is the ecology of collapse, and it has a shape that we can now recognize because we have spent decades assembling the data to see it. You build a complex system under favorable conditions. The system grows, elaborates, depends increasingly on those favorable conditions continuing. The conditions shift. The system, which cannot easily shrink back to a simpler form, because too many people depend on it, because too much political authority is invested in maintaining it, because the cultural logic of your civilization is built around expansion and monument and accumulation. The system continues trying to function as if the conditions had not changed. And then, eventually, it cannot. What is left, after the cannot, is silence, and ruins, and the long, slow work of understanding. In the 1980s and 1990s, a new technology began to transform the archaeology of the Maya lowlands with a speed and completeness that no one had fully anticipated. It was called LiDAR, light detection and ranging, and it works by firing millions of laser pulses from an aircraft toward the ground and measuring the time each pulse takes to return. The result is a three-dimensional map of the terrain beneath the aircraft, precise to within a matter of centimeters. In a landscape covered by jungle, LiDAR can see through the canopy. It can distinguish the shapes of buried walls and platforms and causeways from the natural contours of the land beneath the trees. And what it has been revealing, year after year, as survey teams fly it over larger and larger sections of the Maya lowlands, is a landscape far more thoroughly and densely humanized than anyone had imagined. In the year 2018, a research consortium published the results of a LiDAR survey covering more than 2,000 square kilometers of northern Guatemala. What they found beneath the jungle canopy was staggering. Not scattered cities separated by wilderness, but a vast, interconnected landscape of settlements, agricultural terraces, defensive earthworks, and causeways. A landscape so thoroughly shaped by human hands that the researchers described it as something closer to a medieval European countryside than to the jungle clearings that earlier archaeology had suggested. The implications for understanding the collapse are profound. If the population of the Maya lowlands at the classic peak was not 5 million or 10 million, but potentially more than 10 million, some researchers now suggest figures approaching 15 million or higher. Then the scale of the agricultural effort required to feed that population, and the scale of the landscape transformation that effort entailed, was vastly greater than previous models had assumed. And vastly greater than previous models had assumed means vastly greater pressure on the soil, on the water, on the forests, on the political systems that had to organize and coordinate and compel all of that effort across generations. It means that the Maya lowlands at their peak were not a garden. They were something closer to a machine, a finely tuned, intensely managed, extraordinarily productive machine for converting tropical landscape into human civilization. And like all machines, they required constant maintenance, constant inputs, constant human attention to keep functioning. The LiDAR surveys have also revealed something else, something quieter, but in some ways even more significant. The causeways across the Maya lowlands, connecting cities to each other and to their agricultural hinterlands, LiDAR has traced an elaborate network of raised white roads, the Sakbiab, in the Maya language, literally the white ways, that link the urban centers of the classic period into a system of physical connection that no one had previously grasped in its full extent. Some of these causeways stretch for tens of kilometers. They were engineered to precise levels across uneven terrain, built from limestone rubble and coated in the same brilliant white plaster that surfaced the plazas and pyramids of the cities they served. These were not footpaths. They were infrastructure in the fullest sense, investments of collective labor designed to facilitate movement and trade and the coordination of political authority across a landscape too large and too complex to govern by proximity alone. They were the nervous system of the classic Maya world, connecting its parts into something that functioned, at its best, as an integrated whole. And when you see them from above, traced in the LiDAR data like pale threads through the green, you understand something about the collapse that no amount of reading about drought or warfare quite prepares you for. You understand how much had to be maintained, how many people had to keep showing up, day after day, generation after generation, to resurface the plaster and clear the encroaching vegetation and keep the causeways passable and the reservoirs clean and the terraces intact. You understand that the classic Maya world was not a natural state of affairs. It was an achievement, continuously renewed, dependent on the willingness and the capacity of its people to sustain it. When that willingness flagged, when hunger made people desperate, when warfare made movement dangerous, when political authority lost the sacred legitimacy that compelled collective action, the infrastructure began to deteriorate faster than anyone could repair it. The causeways cracked and were not resurfaced. The reservoirs silted up and were not dredged. The terraces eroded and were not rebuilt. And each piece of deteriorating infrastructure made the next drought harder to survive, made the next failed harvest more catastrophic, made the political situation a little more desperate, and the population a little more willing to simply walk away. Because that is, ultimately, what most of them did. They walked away. This is perhaps the most important corrective that modern archaeology has offered to the old narrative of the Maya collapse, the understanding that abandonment was not failure in the way we tend to use that word. It was a rational response to deteriorating conditions. When the system that had sustained your family for generations could no longer sustain you, you went somewhere that could. You moved north. You moved toward the coasts, where marine resources provided a buffer against agricultural failure. You moved toward the cenotes of the northern Yucatan, where water was more reliably available. You moved toward the trade networks that were still functioning, toward the cities that still had food, toward whatever combination of resources and social connections offered the best chance for your children to survive. Migration is adaptation. It has always been adaptation. And the Maya who abandoned the cities of the southern lowlands in the 9th and 10th centuries were doing what human beings have always done when the place they are living can no longer support them. They were finding somewhere else. The tragedy is not the migration. The tragedy is the magnitude of what was lost in the process. Because when you abandon a city, you cannot take the architecture with you. You cannot carry the carved stele, or the painted murals, or the astronomical records inscribed in stone. You cannot take the reservoirs, or the causeways, or the terraced fields that 100 generations of collective labor had built into the landscape. All of that stays. All of that goes back to the jungle. and the knowledge embedded in the management of that landscape, the intimate, accumulated understanding of which fields flood in which seasons, which reservoirs can be relied upon in a drought year, which forest patches need to be maintained to regulate the local hydrology. That knowledge, passed person to person and generation to generation in the way that all practical knowledge is passed, dissolves when the communities that carried it dissolve. There's a term for this that researchers in the field of historical ecology have begun to use: shifting baseline syndrome. It describes the way that each new generation accepts the conditions of its own childhood as the natural baseline, the normal state of things, without necessarily knowing what those conditions represented relative to what came before. The descendants of the classic Maya who rebuilt their lives in the northern Yucatan did not remember, in any practical sense, the agricultural systems of the Peton. They could not remember how to manage terraced fields in a landscape they had never lived in. They built new systems suited to their new environments, and those systems were extraordinary in their own right. But they were not the same. Something was genuinely, irrecoverably lost. And here we arrive at what might be the deepest question that the classic Maya collapse poses to us. Not just how it happened, not just what combination of drought and warfare and deforestation and political failure produced the abandonment of the cities, but what it means that a civilization of that sophistication and that scale could become, within a few generations, archaeologically invisible to its own descendants. The Maya who were living in the Yucatan when the Spanish arrived in the 16th century knew that there were ruins in the jungle. They had stories about them, mythological frameworks for understanding them, but the administrative and literary traditions that would have allowed them to read the inscriptions on those ruins, to connect the names and dates carved in stone to the living history of their own people, those traditions had been broken. The chain of transmission had snapped somewhere in the long crisis of the 9th and 10th centuries, and the break was permanent. What would it mean to you to stand in front of a document written by your great-great-great-grandparents and be unable to read it? Not because the language has changed, though that too, but because the very script, the system of signs in which the document was composed, has become unreadable? To know that there's meaning there, that the marks on the surface are not random, that someone you are descended from put them there with great care and intention, and to be unable to recover what they said? That is the condition the Maya were in for centuries, and it is the condition that the decipherment slowly, painstakingly, began to correct. The work continues today, and it is increasingly collaborative in ways that the early generations of epigrapher could not have imagined. The Academia de Lenguas Mayas de Guatemala, established in 1990, works to document and preserve the more than 20 Maya languages spoken within Guatemala's borders. Indigenous Maya scholars are engaging with the hieroglyphic corpus as part of a broader project of cultural recovery that encompasses language revitalization, land rights advocacy, and the documentation of oral traditions that have survived alongside and sometimes beneath the official historical record. In the highlands of Chiapas and Guatemala, Maya communities have been engaged in a decades-long process of what some scholars call decolonizing history, of insisting that the story of their civilization not be told only by outsiders, not be framed only through the categories and concerns of Western academia, but be returned, as much as possible, to the people whose ancestors made it. This is not without its complications. The relationship between academic archaeology and indigenous communities has been fraught for most of the history of the discipline, marked by extraction, by the removal of artifacts to foreign museums, by the excavation of sacred sites without consultation, by the publication of findings that affected living communities, without those communities having any meaningful say in how the work was done or how it was represented. The field has changed, slowly and not always willingly, under pressure from indigenous rights movements and from scholars within the academy who have insisted on a more ethical and collaborative practice. But the conversation is happening, and the conversation matters because the classic Maya collapse is not only an archaeological puzzle, It is a living cultural question, with implications for people who are alive right now, who carry that history in their languages and their ceremonies and their relationships to the landscape that their ancestors shaped. When a Keki Maya farmer in Alta Verapaz manages his milpa, the traditional polyculture agricultural system of maize, beans, and squash that has been practiced in Mesoamerica for thousands of years, he is participating in a tradition of landscape knowledge that predates the classic period. The milpa is not the sophisticated hydraulic agriculture of the great lowland cities. It is older than that, and in some ways more resilient. A system designed not for maximum yield under ideal conditions, but for sustainability across variable ones. The classic Maya, in their extraordinary ambition, pushed beyond the milpa into intensive monoculture and hydraulic management, and all the productive power that brought. The milpa survived the collapse because it was simpler, more flexible, more deeply adapted to the underlying ecology of the landscape. There is something quietly important in that. The sophisticated system failed. The older, humbler system endured. The ruins of the great cities are still there, of course. Tikal and Palenque and Copan and Chichen Itza, and the hundreds of smaller sites that at the lowland landscape like the remnants of a conversation conducted in stone. Every year, new excavations reveal new details. A painted room here, a buried cache there, a hieroglyphic text that reshuffles our understanding of a particular political episode. Every year, the LiDAR surveys push further into unmapped territory and return with images of things that nobody expected to find. In 2017, archaeologists working at the site of Zunantunik in Belize uncovered the largest known Maya frieze ever discovered, a massive carved panel depicting the Maya creation mythology with a richness of detail that had no known parallel. It had been buried deliberately, sealed inside a structure that was later built over it, preserved in darkness for more than 1,000 years. When the excavators opened the chamber and shone their lights inside for the first time, what they saw was color. The original red and cream and black paint still visible on the carved surface, the figures still sharp, the narrative still legible to anyone who knew how to read it. 1,000 years in the dark, and still speaking. That is the thing about the Maya, the thing that no account of the collapse should ever lose sight of for long. The silence of the abandoned cities is real. The losses are real. The suffering of the people who lived through the slow unraveling of the classic world was real, and we should not romanticize it or soften it into something more comfortable than it was. But silence is not the end of the story. It never has been with the Maya. The stones kept their paint in the dark. The languages kept their roots across the centuries of catastrophe. The milpa kept its rhythms through everything. And the people, the 6 to 8 million people who speak Maya languages today, who farm the same highlands and lowlands their ancestors farmed, who observe ceremonies that carry the memory of the classic period in their structure even when the specific history has been forgotten. The people kept going. Keeping going is, when you think about it, the most radical thing a civilization can do. Not the building of pyramids, not the mapping of stars, not the carving of history into limestone with tools made of stone and obsidian, and the accumulated patience of generations. Those things are extraordinary, genuinely, and without qualification. But they are, in a sense, the easy part, the visible part, the part that photographs well and fills museums and appears on travel posters. The harder thing, the thing that requires a different and less celebrated kind of courage, is simply continuing, waking up in a world that has been diminished, that has lost things it will never recover, and deciding that it is still worth planting the maize and raising the children and passing the language forward to the next generation. The Maya did this. They did it through the collapse of the classic cities. They did it through the epidemics of the 16th century that took, in some communities, 9 out of every 10 people. They did it through the violence of the conquest, through the burning of the books, through the systematic dismantling of the political and religious structures that had organized their societies for centuries. They did it through 300 years of colonial rule, through independence movements that largely forgot them, through 20th century civil wars that in the case of Guatemala produced atrocities against Maya communities that international human rights organizations have not hesitated to call genocide. And they are still doing it. This persistence is not a miracle in the sense of something inexplicable. It is explicable. It is the result of specific choices made by specific people in specific moments. A grandmother who refused to stop speaking her language to her grandchildren. A farmer who kept the seed varieties his father had kept. A community that maintained its ceremonial calendar even when doing so carried genuine risk. History is made of those choices, the small ones that never appear in any inscription, that leave no archaeological trace, that can only be inferred from the fact of survival itself. But knowing that it is explicable does not make it any less remarkable, and it changes the way we should understand the classic Maya collapse, not as the death of a civilization, but as the most severe crisis in a very long story that is still being written. A story with catastrophic chapters, yes, with losses that genuinely diminish the whole of human history, but a story without an ending, at least not yet. Now, there's a question that serious researchers still argue about, and that I want to spend a little time with, because it is the one that tends to get lost in the larger drama of drought and warfare and political collapse. It is a question about time, specifically about how long it took for the people of the southern lowlands to understand that what they were experiencing was not a temporary crisis, but a permanent transformation. This matters because it bears on one of the most contested issues in the archaeology of the collapse, the question of agency. To what extent were the people of the classic period active agents in their own story, making choices and taking actions, versus passive subjects of forces too large and too slow to be perceived, let alone resisted? The answer, as with almost everything in this story, is complicated. On one hand, the evidence strongly suggests that many of the pressures driving the collapse were genuinely beyond the perception of the people experiencing them. Nobody in the 9th century had lake sediment cores. Nobody had the capacity to look at the pollen record and understand that the forest cover of the previous 2 centuries had been reduced by a significant fraction. Nobody could plot the rainfall data on a graph and see the long-term trend. The feedback loops that were tightening around classic Maya civilization were operating on timescales, decades, generations, centuries, that made them invisible from within any individual human life. On the other hand, the inscriptions and the archaeology together tell a story of people who were acutely aware that something was wrong, who were responding to that awareness with urgency, and who were sometimes making decisions whose consequences they appear to have understood quite clearly. The defensive earthworks, the fortified cities, the Dos Pilas wall built from dismantled monuments, the shifting of political alliances, the diplomatic marriages, like the one that sent Lady Six Sky to Naranjo, the construction of new reservoirs in the terminal classic period, precisely the centuries of peak drought, people trying, with the tools they had, to engineer their way out of a water crisis they could see but could not fully explain. These are not the actions of a people who did not know they were in trouble. They are the actions of a people who knew they were in trouble and were trying everything they could think of to get out of it. They were just working with incomplete information in a system too complex for any single actor to fully comprehend, under time pressure that made long-term thinking almost impossibly difficult, which is to say, they were human, doing what humans do, making the best decisions they could with the knowledge they had, in the circumstances they faced, for the people they loved. There is a site in the Petén region of Guatemala called Aguateca that offers one of the most vivid and heartbreaking windows into the human experience of the collapse that archaeology has yet uncovered. Aguateca was a city that ended suddenly, not in the slow, gradual way of Tikal or Copan, not a generations-long diminishment ending in quiet abandonment, but in a rapid, violent assault sometime around the year 810 of the Common Era, 810 CE. The attackers came quickly enough that the residents did not have time to take everything. When archaeologists excavated the structures of Aguateca in the 1980s and 1990s, they found rooms still full of objects: obsidian blades, grinding stones, ceramic vessels still containing residues of the food that had been stored in them, needles, spindle whorls, the tools of daily life, left exactly where they had been dropped or abandoned in the panic of a sudden flight. One room contained the remnants of what appears to have been a scribe's workshop: stone tools for carving, pigments, the burnt fragments of perishable materials that were almost certainly bark paper manuscripts. The scribe who worked in that room left in a hurry. Whatever books survived the fire that destroyed the city did not survive long. And the knowledge in those books, specific to that person, that training, that tradition, went with him. Aguateca was never reoccupied. Its ruins sit today on a peninsula above a river in the Pedon, accessible only by boat, visited by very few people. Its collapsed structures still full of the ordinary objects of interrupted lives. If you could stand there in the early morning, when the mist is on the river and the birds are beginning and the jungle is still half asleep, you might feel it, that particular quality of ending. Not the abstract ending of history books, but the intimate ending of a specific morning, on a specific day, when the people who lived there realized they would not be coming back. The archaeology of sudden abandonment is different in character from the archaeology of gradual decline. It is more intimate. It catches people in the middle of things. And Aguateca, more than almost any other Maya site, catches you emotionally off guard, because the objects on the floors of its rooms are not monumental. They are domestic. They are the kind of things that, translated into different materials and a different century, you might find on the floors of your own home. A grinding stone is a grinding stone. The person who left it behind was feeding someone she loved. That continuity across 12 centuries, the basic human continuity of feeding people you love, of making things with your hands, of carving meaning into whatever surface is available, is perhaps the most important thing that the story of the classic Maya has to offer to anyone willing to sit with it long enough. We tend to look at ancient civilizations from the outside and see the large things, the pyramids, the kings, the calendars, the wars, and those things are real and they matter and they deserve the attention we give them. But inside every great civilization, sustaining every pyramid and every calendar and every royal bloodline, are millions of ordinary lives being lived with the same mixture of hope and fear and love and exhaustion that characterize ordinary lives in any era. The farmer who woke before dawn to tend his milpa, the woman who ground maize in the blue light of early morning, the child who ran across the white plaza and felt the heat of the stone through the soles of his feet, the scribe who mixed her pigments with the focused care of someone who understood that what she was writing would outlast her, the astronomer who climbed the observatory tower at midnight and pointed his unaided eye at Venus and wrote down what he saw with the calm certainty that the number mattered. These are the people the collapse took, not abstractions, not historical forces, people. And the question the collapse asks, the question it has been asking for 12 centuries, quietly, from the mouths of abandoned wells and the shadows of overgrown plazas and the careful stratigraphy of lake sediment cores, is not really a question about the Maya at all. It is a question about complexity, about the systems we build to sustain ourselves, and what happens when those systems grow too elaborate, too dependent on conditions that cannot be guaranteed, too large for any human being to hold in mind all at once. It is a question about the gap between the speed at which a civilization can build and the speed at which it can understand what it has built, about whether it is possible to see the long-term consequences of short-term decisions clearly enough, and soon enough, to actually change course. The Maya could not in the classic period. not in the southern lowlands, where the combination of factors was too severe, the feedback loops too tight, the accumulated pressure too great. But they tried. The earthworks and the reservoirs and the political marriages and the desperate late monuments and the families that simply gathered what they could carry and walked north. All of it is evidence of trying, of a civilization that did not accept its fate passively, but pushed back against it with everything available, and was ultimately overwhelmed by forces larger than any single response could address. There is no clean lesson in that. History rarely offers clean lessons, and anyone who claims to have extracted a simple moral from the collapse of a civilization is probably simplifying something that deserves better. What the Maya story offers instead is something more valuable than a lesson. It offers a mirror, a long, detailed, carefully assembled mirror in which, if you look honestly and without flinching, you can see certain things about the nature of human civilization that are difficult to see from the inside of your own. The way complexity accumulates faster than understanding. The way the pressures of the present crowd out the warnings of the future. The way political authority, under stress, tends to perform confidence rather than acknowledge doubt. The way ordinary people, caught inside systems too large to comprehend, make rational decisions that collectively produce irrational outcomes. The way things that seem permanent are not. The way things that seem lost sometimes survive, in unexpected forms, in unexpected places. And the way that the work of understanding, the patient, stubborn, unglamorous work of drilling lake cores and deciphering glyphs and sifting ancient pollen and listening to what the people who are still here have to say, that work is never finished. There's always more to know. The jungle is still full of unexcavated cities. The sediment is still full of unread seasons. The languages are still full of words that carry meanings older than the classic period, older than the pyramids, older than any monument that has yet been found. The stones are still speaking. You just have to be quiet enough to hear them. And perhaps that is the right note on which to let this story settle. Not with conclusions, because the story does not have conclusions. Not yet. But with that image. The jungle at dusk. The last amber light catching the top of a pyramid that no one has climbed in 1,000 years. The sound of the birds beginning their evening noise. The smell of rain that may or may not come. And somewhere underneath all of that, the patient, layered, extraordinary record of a civilization that built wonders and made mistakes and suffered and adapted and persisted and is persisting still. There is something deeply comforting in that, if you let yourself feel it. The human capacity to endure, to carry knowledge forward through catastrophe, to plant something in diminished soil and wait and tend it and hope. It is not a triumphant comfort. It is quieter than that, more honest, but it is real. And realness, in the end, is what makes a story worth telling in the dark. Thank you for spending this night with the Maya. Thank you for following their cities and their kings and their scribes and their farmers across 12 centuries of extraordinary history. Thank you for staying curious in a world that makes it easy not to be. Sleep well. I'll be here when the night gets long again.